Hello, everybody. This is Fun Police, and today we are reaching nearly the end of our Nation Guide videos. For today, we are taking a look at the first American Civil War faction, and that is the United States of America. The USA is a very well-rounded force. It leans into a quantity build, being a bit of a spammy nation, and also being able to get decently into melee. However, the nation is diversified in a variety of different ways. The most notable one being that instead of having negative perks on its units, instead, for the most part, its units just have low cohesion. This is a unique thing of the American factions in that they do not have any heavy infantry, and for the most part, their units only sit on 3 cohesion, with only some of their more elite units having 4. On top of that, however, they do also have very strong cavalry. In fact, I would be willing to say the US and the Confederacy have the best artillery in the best cavalry in the entire game. And then their artillery is actually above bar, being pretty good outside of certain elite nations like Prussia, who clearly have better artillery. If you enjoyed today's content, make sure to like and subscribe. We have one last nation guide, and you can also watch the other nation guides, as I've now covered all the base game and both Boshin War factions. So you don't want to miss out on that last guide for the Confederacy, and you also want to check out those other guides to learn how those nations work. But now, let's go ahead and jump into the early period where we will talk about the units and then how to build the USA. The early period US is a very well-rounded faction, able to pretty much do a bit of everything. Its lower cost units allow it to generally build itself in a variety of ways. On top of that, combined with the fact it has 4 rifles alongside uniquely having 2 rifled breech loaders, although they are limited to the sharpshooting unit, gives the US plenty of ranged firepower, and this is combined with other things that we'll talk about in a moment. But starting with the infantry, we have the state militia. The state militia are essentially cheap filler units. They're your cheapest option for infantry, but loaded with breakable, they don't last long when the fighting gets up close and personal. They also, because they are militia, they can't sit in open order, making them a bit more vulnerable overall. The main purpose of these guys is generally to be holding flanks or to provide emergency fire support in places that you might need extra troops. They can help bulk out your numbers and just give you a little bit more in terms of firepower when you need it. Then you have the volunteers, the standard line infantry for the Union. The main thing is that they have 3 cohesion. This is a trend that a lot of the US infantry has, is that they are essentially just vanilla versions of other infantry like the French line infantry, but they have less cohesion. This makes them much cheaper, being only 75 points or 105 with a rifle. However, you do have to play a bit more carefully with them. They don't have the endurance to last long in firefights, and even in open order, they can be vulnerable to focus firing. However, you do get the benefit of bringing more numbers of them, allowing you to generally build up a large army that isn't that bad as long as you don't allow your units to get exposed to fire for too long. That's one of the biggest keys with the US, is maintaining your cohesion because you have a limited amount of it compared to some of the other nations out there. We also have the Zouaves, a 6'3" melee drill line infantry, essentially just a volunteer with melee drill put on it. Melee drill is overall a fine perk. The biggest thing with it is that these guys are much more durable in melee. They can either be used as a unit to go into melees with charges themselves, or they can just be generally more resistant to charges while sitting in something like open order. You get a good amount of flexibility with these guys, and they can be worth that price overall, being able to be both defense and offense. You also have the Irish Brigade. The Irish Brigade is essentially the same thing as the last two infantry, but they have shock and essentially are the parallel to Zouaves. The Irish Brigade is the aggressive version of these two. Shock demands you get into a charge with them in order to maximize their damage, while Zouaves can be a bit more defensive. Irish are great line breakers. For only 100 points, you have a shock infantry with no negative perks on it, meaning you can throw these guys into melees and they'll generally hold their own for a little bit. Combine them with a Zouave and you have a very powerful 1-2 punch that you could make work with. You then have the Skirmish Detachment. The Skirmish Detachment is a very small but effective cheap unit. With Skirmishing and Rugged being the only rugged unit in the early period for the US, they do have their use in that regard, being able to sit in forests and move through rivers and flank if you need them to. However, they only have 2 cohesion, making them very, very weak to fire. And with Breakable, their low health does not work well either. If you need rugged units, that is probably the main use to utilize these. Although these guys can also be used as cheap throwaway units. It's pretty easy to bring 2 of these and put them in, say, a forest or a town or something, and they can be very annoying to the enemy, demanding a lot of resources for something that doesn't cost a lot. They're good cannon fodder, but they definitely do not hold up in a sustained fight. You then have the US Sharpshooters. With range drill, skirmishing, and 3 cohesion, these are your primary range damage dealers. This is even more exemplified by the fact that they are the only units to get rifled breechloaders in the early period. And this makes the US Sharpshooters very, very powerful. They aren't the most maneuverable, and they still are a bit squishy, but there's honestly not a unit that has the amount of firepower that this does in the early period, and that can be really, really strong. The flexibility is just very high, and if you're ever looking for ranged firepower, the sharpshooters with their sharps rifles are really strong. Then you have the regular infantry. This is our first 4 cohesion infantry. Containing efficiency, these are actually really solid core units. They're generally just quite flexible, and they are limited to 2, meaning you can't build an army completely of them. However, they help to give your army some flexibility, being more durable and also more nimble than the slower and a little bit more fragile 3 cohesion units. In general, I would say this is a unit that can fit into almost any build and will generally feel pretty useful in that. And then we round things off with the Iron Brigade. The Iron Brigade is another 4 cohesion infantry. This one, however, is armed with shock and range drill, kind of making them an interesting dual-use unit. Range drill encourages shooting at range, but shock encourages up-close aggression. And the Iron Brigade essentially serves as a dual-purpose unit, either able to act as a shock unit if you need to get into a melee, but also being able to sit back in range and shoot at stuff. You do need to be careful with them because losing these guys in a melee can be an expensive loss since you've bought range drill on them, but that dual flexibility can be very useful. They can hit pretty hard, they're durable enough to last, and if the fighting gets close, their charges can be devastating, so they can be very, very powerful. Moving on to the cavalry, we start off with volunteer cavalry. Low health and low cohesion combined with breakable and disorganized makes these volunteer cavalry very, very weak. However, they are also stupid cheap. With melee only, they are one of the cheapest units in the entire roster, and even with just a basic carbine, they're still about the same price as a volunteer infantry, but retain much more mobility and can be useful for flanking and pressuring the enemy on the sides. It's honestly not hard to work one of these into a build, and especially because the US actually likes to have a couple cavalry units around, the volunteers can just make it so the enemy always has to be guarding their flanks or risk one of the numerous cavalry flanking them and dealing damage. You then have the Lightning Brigade. This is essentially a much better version of the Volunteer Cavalry, trading away Breakable for efficiency. This drives the price of the unit up quite a bit, but makes the unit far more nimble. They're able to run around, dismount, and take shots at the enemy, or mount up and dash away when they need to. This Organized does leave them a bit fragile in terms of shooting at enemies and generally being able to stay in a firefight, but they're actually just very flexible, and they can be a very nice addition to an army that otherwise doesn't have a lot of efficiency. And then you have Custer's Brigade, essentially the shock cavalry. With shock skirmishing, they have the highest stat line of early period US cavalry and disorganized. They move fast and hit quite hard, being one of the best shock units you pretty much have for the US. They are generally very, very effective, and with skirmishing, they can even be used to dismount and take shots at the enemy in order to cause some damage and mess them up before going in for that charge. Moving on to the artillery, we start off with the 12-pounder Napoleon. Overall, a basic artillery piece, but this one is very notable because, unlike a lot of other nations, there's no cumbersome on these. This means this unit can set up and shoot on the same turn. It can pivot and shoot on the same turn. It can change formation and shoot on the same turn. That gives the Union artillery a lot of flexibility. And although they do cost more, it's well worth it. This piece is still relatively cheap, but gives you a solid way to suppress enemy units and generally be mobile on the battlefield. They can quickly adjust to threats and pressure the enemy effectively. You also have the 3-inch ordnance rifle, which is unique and is actually a very high quality artillery piece because instead of anti-personnel fire, it has range drill combined with 4 range, and this is actually really powerful. It will chip away at the enemy's cohesion quite massively, and the range drill means it is dealing 3 damage per shot when it shoots at something in concentrated battery. It's a very high-powered artillery piece, and although it is the most expensive one, it is very capable and is a great addition to Union builds. You also have the horse version of the 12-pounder Napoleon, essentially just one more movement. If you're willing to spend the extra money, it just outclasses the basic Napoleon. Being more mobile allows it to get into position quicker, and because it's able to set up faster, it can generally be very, very quick and nimble. You also have the 12-pounder mountain gun, a unique artillery piece. It has indirect fire and rugged, allowing it to move into rugged terrain, and then also it can shoot over friendly units. It's actually quite a solid artillery piece, very similar to the 12-pounder Napoleon, and essentially serving as a bit of a side grade similar to the horse artillery. You are paying more for it, but you do get some extra utility because indirect fire is very, very useful as it can be safely behind your units and still attack the enemy. And then you have the 12-pound howitzers, which are 4-range indirect fire. Now, these have cumbersome, which does make them a little bit slower. But, on the other hand, if you're looking for indirect fire artillery, this is the highest range one you have and gives them a little bit of use in that role. In terms of building various decks, you can pretty much build the US in any way. I've said this in a couple other videos, but the US is truly able to build with all 3 of its tabs in mind. Able to build itself for range combat, melee, a mix of both. It can go in many, many different directions. One example is going more so with a quality build, or I guess more so of a range build, focusing heavily on the use of rifles, heavy artillery, and then some cavalry to back up your army. You have double regular and double volunteer to gun people down with rifles. Sharpshooters and the 3-inch ordnance rifle serve as damage dealers. You have 2 Irish Brigade as cheap shock options. Then you also have Lightning Brigade and a cheap volunteer cavalry to throw into the line. You could also very easily swap out the Irish Brigades for Zouaves if you wanted to, or anything like that. So there is just a variety of different options you could build in this regard. But another way could be leaning more heavily into melee. Instead, utilizing a variety of the Zouaves and Irish Brigade to really just have a ton of melee tools available. With double Iron Brigade and 3 Zouaves, 2 Irish Brigades, and Custer, pretty much all of your guys have some melee perk on them. You do have US Sharpshooter, and then also 2 Iron Brigades to cover your ranged options, and then you just have everything go into melee whenever the enemy gets close. Both of these builds are generally going to be effective, but you can of course tweak them as you want, going wider with, say, more volunteers and state militia, or incorporating a different artillery piece, a variety of different things. But now, let's go ahead and jump into the late period where we can see how the US evolves. The late period for the US adds a variety of new units, most notably bulking out their cavalry and artillery tabs a bit, in order to give them some new units. However, there needs to be mention of one thing specifically, and that is the rifled breechloader actually changes in the late period, becoming the M1865 Spencer rifle. And unlike the Sharps of the early period, this can be put on any infantry available to the US. This does mean that you still retain the limit of 2, but it does open up more availability for higher firepower with the infantry tab. But talking about the new units, we start off with the Buffalo Soldiers. The Buffalo Soldiers are very durable, rugged cavalry. This gives the US a very, very strong, rugged option. With high health, with good cohesion and melee drill, these guys are very durable and tough to get out of rugged terrain, and that can be combined with the fact that skirmishing allows them to dismount and take shots at the enemy. They can be very well-rounded and generally fill a variety of roles, from quick-moving melee units to things like just rugged units sitting in a forest line shooting at stuff, or a combination of both. You also get the US regular cavalry. Arguably, I would say one of the strongest cavalry units in the game. With high health and cohesion, it is a light cavalry with range drill and skirmishing. There really is not a unit that compares, I would say, to the regular cavalry. With such high movement, while still sporting good stats and range drill, regular cavalry are very, very powerful at shooting at the enemy. And this can make them very good at pressuring and generally keeping the enemy under pressure, especially with a flanking unit as potent as this one. And then in the artillery tab, we have Gatling guns. Sporting low overall stats, the Gatling guns has breech loading, allowing it to deal a lot of damage. No cumbersome allows it to also be very effective at pivoting or setting up and shooting, giving it a little bit of extra utility, although its range is quite low unless you go into concentrated and get that 3 range on it. But it still can be very effective supporting your units. In terms of building the US in the late period, I think they actually open up even more to new and interesting builds. A build that I'm a personal fan of and I actually really find enjoyable is that of a triple build with the cavalry units. Being able to just essentially utilize double Iron Brigade for your ranged firepower, 2 Irish for cheap melee, 2 volunteers to help bulk out your lines, a skirmish detachment because we have some money left over, and then triple cavalry, starting with the US regular, who has range drill and breech loading, allowing it to be very mobile and hard-hitting at a range. Lightning Brigade offers a more nimble option, allowing us to not only save a bit of money, but also have efficiency. And then we round it out with a Custer's Brigade as a cheap melee option. 3 cavalry of this quality is actually potentially very, very strong, able to pressure the enemy down and keep them suppressed. Meanwhile, we just have a lot of shock and rifles running around in our builds, allowing us to keep the enemy relatively wounded even at range. But the big thing is this triple cavalry to pressure them down. But you can do other things as well. One could potentially lean, again, more into the melee options, going more so with a up-close and personal build backed up by a couple ranged options. For example, double regular infantry with air efficiency allows them to be quite effective with the rifled breechloaders. You have a lot of breechloaders on your Irish and Zouaves, and you can also go back to rifles if you want the extra range. It's kind of up to you. But this allows you to pressure the enemy and generally give you a lot of melee tools. A 3-inch ordnance rifle allows you to suppress and deal good damage. Then you have a Custer's Brigade in order to pressure the enemy with additional shock power, and then a Buffalo Soldier to give us some rugged capability and kind of do double duty as both a ranged unit but also as a melee unit as we need to. And that is the United States of America, a very interesting faction. Overall, it is a quantity nation, but it definitely stands out from things like Russia and the Ottomans quite a bit because it is sort of an in-between of those nations. It is not as crappy in terms of its infantry as those, but it definitely does not reach the higher ends of quality like, say, from Britain or France, who can use heavy infantry and other heavy units with high cohesion to win the day. However, the US also has such an interesting and diverse cast of cavalry options that gives it just a lot of oomph and allows it to really pressure the enemy's flanks. And the cavalry tab is definitely, I think, the most standout tab of the United States of America, although that does not mean to discredit the very capable artillery and infantry tabs. They're well-rounded, capable, and if you do pick it up, the Civil War DLC up, they can be very, very fun. They are my personal favorite nation, and I recommend them wholeheartedly. But regardless, that is all I have for you today. If you've watched all the way to the end of the video, make sure to like and subscribe because we have one more guide for the Confederacy coming out in the near future. And I've also done a guide on now almost every nation in Fire and Maneuver, so check those out as well. Otherwise, thanks so much for watching, and I hope you have a good day.